Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So this is your guys' last lecture. Hooray! Our last lecture, you had your last lab exam. We have exam 4, your last lecture exam on Thursday this week. So I'll do a review for that at the end of class. Okay.
Is that going to be in the lab?
Yeah, you guys will show up to lab, but instead of doing a lab, you'll take the lecture exam 4. And then next week, you have your final exam. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the final exam today because I am going to allow you guys to have a little bit input in your final exam. It is standardized, so most of it will be standardized, but I am going to give you guys an opportunity, and if you want to take that opportunity, you can. If not, then we'll just do the standard exam. But I'll talk about that here at the end of class when I do the review for the upcoming exams. So what we need to do today is we need to finish up with the end of chapter 16, I believe, where we talked about consciousness, altered states of consciousness, and then just some discussion about some disorders and the aging and some of the effects of aging on the brain. And then what we'll do is we'll come back and we'll talk about endocrinology in some detail. We did do a 20-30 minute primer in the lab, and I did post that as well for you guys, so you have that video to reference. But let's go ahead and finish up consciousness. So like I said in lab, consciousness is a really tough cookie. We don't have a particularly robust understanding of consciousness. We understand how the neurons work to a good approximation. We understand how they depolarize. We understand action potentials, thresholds, neurotransmitter release, input coming in, some of the integration. We understand how they make circuits, but we can't quite make that leap from the biology, from the neurobiology. We can't make a direct leap from that into what consciousness is. And even defining consciousness is really tough. A standard definition goes something on the lines of it's an awareness of yourself and the environment. Okay? The problem is, how do we define awareness and what does that mean? Right? That, again, is very tricky, right? So we're using a very difficult to define concept to define a very difficult to define concept, right? What do I mean by awareness? What does it mean to be aware? Right? Am I aware? Or what am I aware of? Most of the information, most of the sensory information coming into my body, I am not necessarily consciously aware of. And what do we mean by consciously aware? Well, I think you guys kind of have some understanding of that, right? Like you are actively aware, right? I actively feel the floor, I actively feel temperature, but most of the information coming in, we're not really actively focused on, right? We're not actively focused on, for example, the temperature, or are you actively focused on, sitting in the seat all the time, and maybe you can focus your attention on something, and when you do that, what happens? Well, you lose awareness of other things, so it's really, really complicated. And what's even more complicated is the sense of self. The sense of self that every human being apparently has. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think I described it as, if you guys really think about it, you stop and think about it, doesn't it kind of feel like you're some kind of mind? Like your sense of self, that you're some entity that's controlling a body, right? That you're kind of behind the wheel of a body and you're looking out through the eyes. And you have all this really unique character to yourself. And we really don't have a good way of describing that. So really, really tough problem. And it very well may be some of the top theories right now suggest that consciousness is just kind of a simulation that your brain constructs, and that there really is no, in a real sense, there's no kind of this self and this uniqueness, and it's just kind of like a kind of a construct that your mind makes. But boy, oh boy, I don't know that that's a real satisfactory way of looking at it. So again, it's tough. It's really tough. So you can take neuroscience and psychology and try to figure this out better, but we don't have good answers yet. But we can talk about altering consciousness and in discussing how consciousness, different states of consciousness can help us understand what this concept is a little better. So the first state I'm going to talk about is sleep. Okay, we all know what sleep is somewhat intuitively, but we know it's very important. And when we look at people in sleep, we see that there's increased protein synthesis going on in the neurons. Okay, that is there's a major physical thing that we can find with neurons. What does that mean? Well, that means there's something going on, right? That means those neurons are making proteins, they're building. What role is that going on there? Well, that's a little harder to understand, but it very well may be kind of a resetting mechanism, a resting mechanism, a repair mechanism, and it may even be involved in memory consolidation, what we talked about last week when we talked about short-term and long-term memory and consolidating and storing long-term memory. So that's really interesting. There are two major phases of sleep. Okay, there is what we call deep sleep. This is also known as slow wave sleep. And the reason that we call this slow wave sleep is oftentimes when people sleep, we can monitor the surface activity, the electrical activity on the surface of their brain through something known as an EEG, an electroencephalogram. Enceph just means brain, right? Ceph is brain. And so it is looking at the electrical activity on the very surface of the brain. So an EEG is very superficial. But what we see these really slow waves. And there are some pictures of EEGs in your book as well toward the end of chapter 16. You're not going to have to interpret anything like that or test or anything. We do see a marked decrease in heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and overall metabolism by about 30% in deep sleep. Okay? Slow wave sleep, same thing. This is also known as non-REM sleep. And why is it known as non-REM sleep? Because the other major type, or the other major component of sleep, is something called REM sleep. Does anyone know what REM stands for? Rapid eye movement. Okay, this is one of the characteristic physical findings we see in somebody in REM sleep versus slow wave or deep sleep. Is in REM sleep they have rapid movements of their eyes, hence the term rapid eye movement. What major thing occurs during REM sleep? Dreaming, yes. Dreaming is one of the major concepts or the components of what's going on during REM sleep. Okay. We also find that most people that go into REM sleep, their motor neurons become suppressed. Do you think that's a good or a bad thing? Your motor neurons become inhibited when you go into REM sleep. Is that something you want to happen, or would you rather that not happen?
Yes.
Yes? Why yes? If you answered yes, why? Why?
Flailing or something?
There you go, right? Because what happens during your dreams, when you dream, those of you that remember each dreams, do they feel real at the time?
Yeah.
Does it feel like a real experience? Does it feel believable? Do you feel like you're moving around? And have you had a bad dream where you're running around, you're fighting something, you're moving, you're thrashing? Do you necessarily want to be doing that all over the place? No. And so this seems to be the reason why you have motor neuron inhibition. And when those motor neurons aren't inhibited, right, you have certain disorders like sleepwalking, right, where people can walk around, maybe even talk in their sleep, right? They wouldn't normally do that if they had this normal motor neuron inhibition. Now, this motor neuron inhibition can also lead to a relatively common disorder known as sleep paralysis. And sleep paralysis is believed to be behind many of the reports of people reporting to be visited by demons or possessed, or even UFO abductions. This phenomenon, which is a fairly common phenomenon of sleep paralysis, seems to be behind it. And what happens in sleep paralysis is, usually when you wake up, this goes away, your motor neurons come back online, you can move around. But sometimes when people perhaps wake up, or they have increased level of consciousness, where they have external awareness, okay, their motor neurons may still be inhibited. So what will happen is you'll have some awareness of your environment, but you'll be completely paralyzed. Anyone ever had that happen to them, or have that sensation where you can't move? And then you want to even scream, right? Some of you have been so you get terrified and you can hear things, and you might possibly still have some dream activity going on. So you have kind of this dreamlike activity, and maybe you hear things or you feel like there's a presence in the room, but you're completely paralyzed and you're powerless to do anything about it. And this phenomenon is known as sleep paralysis. It's relatively common. It's a very terrifying thing, and it does seem to be behind a lot of these reports of alien abductions and demonic possession, things like that. So it's a really important thing. What we normally see is we see this alternating between REM and non-REM sleep. Most of the time we're in deep sleep or non-REM sleep, and then from periods of anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes, what'll happen is you'll cycle into REM sleep, and you'll go into REM sleep for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, and then you go back into deep sleep, and you'll cycle back into REM sleep. Yeah?
Is it bad to never have dreams?
Oh, you have dreams. Most people don't remember their dreams, because for you to remember your dream, you have to be woken up in the middle of REM sleep, in the middle of a dream. But if you wake up in deep sleep, you're not dreaming, so you don't remember dreams. So most of us don't remember any of our dreams, and the dreams that we do remember are because we just happen to wake up in the middle of REM sleep. Yeah, so yeah, most of your dreaming goes completely unremembered, believe it or not.
Does that mean that people who remember their dreams more often than not are pretty light sleep?
It could be disorders, certain sleeping disorders, certain physiology, drugs like caffeine. So there are a lot of reasons behind what might be going on there. It's important, and we know about 24-25% of all Americans suffer from some sort of sleep disorder, sleep paralysis, insomnia, inability to go to sleep or get sufficient amounts of sleep. Some people have what's called sleep apnea, where they actually quit breathing when they sleep, and their carbon dioxide levels get high and their oxygen levels get low. And so you have a lot of sleeping disorders. And one thing you need to remember, or it's important to remember, is when somebody takes a sleeping pill, okay, those medications tend to work on neurotransmitters, right, like GABA and things like that. So if you take a sleeping pill, some benzodiazepine that works on GABA that inhibits the neurons, will you appear to be asleep? Yes, but will you have this normal sleep cycle of deep sleep, REM? No, right, because you have altered neurophysiology. So even people that take sleeping pills, if they don't get the right amount of REM and deep sleep, things like that, they can still have lots of problems. So when you go to the hospital and you have a surgery, okay, do you think it's correct to say that somebody is sleeping under anesthesia? Is that a correct thing to say? No. Sleep is a very sleep is a very specific form of consciousness, right? Anesthesia, right? General anesthesia is using drugs to suppress all the neurons, right? That's not putting somebody to sleep. That's making somebody unconscious, right? Very different. And again, that goes into the complexity of defining consciousness. But someone under anesthesia, okay, if you give somebody anesthetics, they are unconscious. Their body is incapable of getting sensory input, cannot come into the brain. That's fundamentally what an unconscious person is sensory input cannot get to the brain. So you can cut on them, right? You can open them up, okay? And that generally produces what's called nociception, right? Nociception is sensory input that is very uncomfortable. But somebody under anesthesia has a very limited ability to respond to that. So they are, for all practical intents and purposes, unconscious in that sense. Okay, some other alterations in consciousness. Psychosis. Okay, psychosis is a big one. Okay, psychosis is not the same thing as a psychopath. Have you guys ever heard the term psychopath? Okay, a psychopath is not necessarily psychotic. Two different terms. So a psychopath is an individual that is very antisocial. They lack empathy. They don't have any concern for other people. Okay, that's a psychopath. Psychosis means that you have lost contact with the reality that everybody else lives in. Okay, so someone who's psychotic has lost contact with reality. Certain things that can cause psychosis: drug overdoses like cocaine, methamphetamines. We actually, when we were first learning about psychosis, we would give animals, and sometimes people, large doses of amphetamines to mimic psychosis, to mimic diseases like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with acute mania. Okay, these kinds of psychological disorders that can manifest as psychosis. What lies behind psychosis? Well, there are some hypotheses. The first major hypothesis is something called the dopamine hypothesis. Okay, and the dopamine hypothesis states that there is too much dopamine in somebody who has a psychotic disorder, like schizophrenia. Okay, they're hallucinating, auditory, visual hallucinations. Okay, negative symptoms like withdrawal and things like that. They have too much dopamine. Why does this hypothesis hold some weight? Because the drugs that we use to treat people with psychosis block dopamine receptors in the central nervous system. Okay? And when we do that, a lot of people with psychosis get better. Unfortunately, the dopamine hypothesis is necessary to understand psychosis, but it's insufficient. It's necessary but insufficient. Why? Because newer antipsychotic drugs not only block dopamine, but they also block serotonin receptors. Okay, so psychosis is much more complicated than just one neurotransmitter, one type of neuron, one type of receptor. It seems to be more complex. But we do know that dopamine and 5-hydroxytryptamine, or serotonin, okay, does play a major role, because drugs that block dopamine and serotonin receptors are very good at treating psychosis in a lot of cases. You guys okay with that?
Isn't ecstasy? Does ecstasy?
Well, I'm going to talk about those drugs here in just a minute. So that actually naturally leads into a discussion of, we also study consciousness by administering substances that perturb or alter consciousness. And these drugs, okay, tend to involve dopamine and serotonin receptors, or 5-hydroxytryptamine. Specifically, the 5-HT2A, right? The 5-hydroxytryptamine 2A receptor. The 5-HT2A receptor is one of the major types of receptors involved in activating altered states of consciousness. And these drugs generally fall into three major categories. Okay? There are many more, but these are the major ones. You have what are called your indole alkylamines. Okay? You don't have to memorize this for this class. This is not in the book either, I don't think. But the indole alkylamines are derived from an amino acid, L-tryptophan. Okay? And these include things like psilocybin, and I've talked about psilocybin before, right? It's one of the major chemicals in magic mushrooms. Also, DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, is another hallucinogenic drug that is an indole alkylamine. The second major category are called the lysergamides. And these are substances that actually come from certain types of molds. And one of the major substances is LSD, or L-sergic acid diethylamide is the chemical name, it's LSD. Okay? And then the third category are what are known as phenethylamines. Okay? And these come from an amino acid, phenylalanine. And so they have a structure that is somewhat similar to sympathetic substances like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And these include things like MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy, and mescaline would fall into that category as well. Okay. And we know we can give these substances, and these substances have very strong affinities for the dopamine and the serotonin systems. The indole alkylamines tend to be more serotonin. The L-sergamides are pretty complex, multiple different neurotransmitters, and the phenethylamines tend to be more dopamine related, if you wanted to kind of simplify that a little bit. And we can use these substances to kind of perturb consciousness and alter people's sense of consciousness and their sense of self. And we find very odd things can happen with some of these substances. One of the interesting things that can happen is something known as synesthesia. You guys have heard of that term, synesthesia? Anyone ever heard of that? Synesthesia is a crossing of your senses. So sounds become colors, colors become sounds. You touch, like you touch something, or you have a temperature and it becomes a musical sound or some sort of color, and you have your senses start kind of crossing over. It's a very, very curious experience. Not that I'm condoning, I'm not condoning going out and doing these. I will say, I told you I would give you guys an anecdote, so I will give you sort of an anecdote. It's probably not particularly helpful, but I do have some experience with some of these, specifically mescaline. I have, a while ago, went out and took a very large dose of a plant. It was a cactus called peyote. I ingested a very large dose of that peyote. One of the major substances in that is mescaline and other alkaloids, and I ended up having some experiences of synesthesia. When the stars came out at night, all the colors of the stars changed, and it was like an orchestra was playing. It was a very odd experience. And then I experienced something known as ego death. It's vernacular ego death, but basically what it is it's a loss of self, where all of the very unique parts of me, the unique part of me that I would say would define me as a human being, as a person, that would separate me from, say, Ernie or somebody else, right? My life experiences and all that just kind of went away, and I was kind of nothing. I just kind of dissolved away into the universe or what have you. So really, really odd experiences. Now again, I'm not condoning or not condemning those kinds of experiences. I'm just saying that we have learned some things about consciousness using some of these substances. And we can give people drugs that block these receptors, these serotonin and these dopamine receptors, and then we'll give them these, and they tend not to have these types of hallucinatory or psychedelic experiences. So we are finding out, okay, there is a very strong correlation with these neurotransmitters and these kinds of receptors. It's not the whole story, but we're beginning to kind of piece things together. I will just say that methamphetamines are somewhat related to the phenethylamines. They're chemically a little different, but what methamphetamines do is very interesting. Is you have transporters. Remember we talked about how neurotransmitters, how the action of a neurotransmitter can go away. You can degrade it with enzymes. You can pump it back into the neuron or to a glial cell through a transporter. I don't remember talking about those mechanisms. Well, one of the mechanisms by which we get rid of things like dopamine, okay, is you have what's called a reuptake transporter. It's a pump that sucks that dopamine back into the neuron. Well, what methamphetamines do is they turn that transporter inside out. Okay, it pops it inside out, and then it causes the neuron just to spew out all of its dopamine and norepinephrine. So it just spews all this dopamine and epinephrine out into the synapse instead of the dopamine and epinephrine getting reuptake and terminating that response. And so these are very strongly associated with psychosis, right? And you guys may or may not have seen or heard about people under the influence of methamphetamines in particular. They can have very bizarre, very aggressive behavior. They can develop like what's called punting behavior. Have you ever heard of that, punting? Punting is like a repetitive behavior, like you take your stereo apart and then you build it again, and you take it apart and you build it again. And this is really repetitive tasks that people do. So again, we're starting to learn. Okay, some other things that we've learned. We've learned a little bit about depression as well. And the leading hypothesis for depression is a serotonin hypothesis, that one of the mechanisms behind certain types of depression is possibly low levels of serotonin. And we've developed classes of drugs. One of the newest class of drugs is known as the Ssri, or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Basically what these drugs do is these drugs block the reuptake pumps for serotonin. So instead of serotonin getting sucked back into the neuron or glial cell, it stays out in the synapse where it can continue to activate its receptors for a longer period of time. And these include drugs like Paxil and Prozac, and in some cases, these SSRIs can help treat depression. Okay, you guys okay with that there? Some of the older antidepressants, though, just to make it more complicated, instead of serotonin, they increased levels of dopamine, and people with depression felt better as well in some cases. So it's not a cut and dry case by any means.
So they say depression is an altered state of consciousness?
Well, not necessarily. It's definitely a different way of experiencing the environment, right? When you're very depressed, you have a very different awareness of who you are, how you relate to the world, than perhaps somebody who's not depressed. So it can cause an altered state. Again, consciousness is a very broad, complicated, and that's what I'm trying to convey, is that it's a complicated, broad concept, and there are lots of facets that go into it. And then I just want to finish by talking about aging and some other diseases that we run into. One disease is called Huntington's disease, or Huntington's chorea. And what we find with this is we actually have the basal nuclei in the brain, and we end up losing very specific neurons. Acetylcholine and GABAergic neurons end up dying off. And this, of course, leads to progressive movement and cognitive disorders. And these people have very jerky, twitchy motion, or what we call chorea, and they can have these spastic outbursts. If you get Huntington's disease, you tend not to live. This tends to kill people. People tend to die. They can live with it for many years, but it does tend to be fatal. Another one is Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease, what we find is a loss of dopamine-producing neurons. So not only is dopamine important in mood, but what else is dopamine important for? Think motor neurons.
Reward pathways?
Well, that's more mood reward pathways, addiction, all that. But aside from that, where else is dopamine critically important? Think motor neurons.
Skeletal.
Yeah, there you go.
Musculoskeletal.
Yeah, for skeletal movement, for motor coordination. Yeah, for motor coordination. And so we end up losing dopamine-producing neurons, and it produces a movement disorder, and this produces something known as ataxia or ataxic gait. And I described that to you guys earlier, right? The drunk walk, right? This drunk walking gait. And these people with Parkinson's, they kind of have some tremor, and they have loss of fine motor coordination. It gets worse and worse and worse, and they end up having problems eating, and they can have problems breathing, and it can actually be fatal in a lot of cases, or complications from Parkinson's. And just to make things interesting, I want to make a connection between Parkinson's disease, and I want to go back here to psychosis. What kinds of drugs do we use to treat psychosis? What do these drugs do? What do they block?
Dopamine and serotonin.
Oh, they block, particularly the older types, block dopamine receptors. Well, what's Parkinson's disease? You lose dopamine, right? Do you see a possible connection here? And the connection is, when we give people these medications, some of these people will develop Parkinson's-like syndromes due to their dopamine receptors being blocked. And this is known as a dystonic reaction. So when we give somebody an antipsychotic, specifically antipsychotics that are very strong dopamine blockers, we can create movement disorders. Okay, they can have a whole variety of movement disorders. They're all known as dystonic reactions. And that's why, because we block dopamine receptors, and dopamine is important for movement, not only consciousness, alertness, awareness, emotion, etc. So let's see here. Let's talk about some age-related changes. There are many different age-related changes with the brain. These changes tend to start at about 30 years of age. Okay, so probably a lot of you guys aren't quite there yet, right? Maybe a couple of you are. Okay, you can join me in that boat. Okay, these are normal age-related changes. You have a decrease in your special senses, okay, particularly your hearing, right? There are lots of hearing loss, be a problem as we get older. Visual changes tend to be problematic. Okay, lots of different things can go into this. Degeneration of the macula, retinal damage, or what we call retinopathy. You can develop a clouding of your lens of your eye. That's something known as a cataract. So lots of different age-related changes with your special senses occur. Your brain kind of shrinks a little bit. Its mass and volume tends to decrease. Okay, and you can even develop something known as being senile. You guys have heard of that? Senile, and you get some cognitive changes, some forgetfulness. And interestingly enough, we see a lot of these changes in older people, right? Their brains a little smaller, we call atrophies, particularly the frontal areas kind of shrinks and atrophies a little bit, this and that. We see some biological and some biochemical changes, but then when we talk to the person, they don't appear to have cognitive deficits. They appear to be alert and oriented, they're talking to you appropriately, have a good memory. So some of these changes aren't necessarily associated with physical manifestations, or at least manifestations that we can identify. However, there are some other cases I just want to mention. In one case are the development of plaques and tangles within the brain tissue. These plaques and tangles often are the result of proteins that misfold. One of the most common culprits is something known as an amyloid protein, and this looks to be one of the problems in a very common form of dementia. That's a progressive memory loss, and that one of the most common causes of dementia in the United States, at least, is something called Alzheimer's disease. And when we look at the brains of people that die that have Alzheimer's disease, they have a lot of these plaques and these tangles and a lot of these amyloid that's built up of amyloid protein. And so there's been a lot of research going into developing drugs that can help combat these and prevent these proteins from misfolding. And I'm not aware of anything particularly fruitful that has come out of that yet, but that it is an area of research. And then finally, a very common problem, something known as stroke. Okay, something known as stroke. And stroke tends to be the result of two problems. And so here I've drawn blood vessels. And you see this blood vessel on top kind of has a deposit building up in it on the inside. That is known as atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is the buildup of plaque on the inside of your blood vessels. Okay, these plaques can develop. The other part of that is something known as arteriosclerosis. Okay, arteriosclerosis is a hardening of the arteries. So the arteries become very hard. They don't move. They're poorly compliant. And together, atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis increases the chance that we may have a stroke. And a stroke tends to be the result of an occlusion of a vessel in the brain. Okay, typically what happens is this plaque ruptures, it breaks off, and when it does that, it activates the clotting mechanisms, and you guys will talk about clotting in more detail next semester. But the clotting cascade gets activated. The blood vessel can't really move a whole lot because it's hardened, and so it clogs up. A big clot develops in that vessel, and then that prevents blood flow from going into that area of the brain, and that results in a stroke. Okay? The book uses the term CVA, or cerebral vascular accident. Okay? The American Heart Association, however, and that's the association that deals with recommendations and guidelines on how to treat and prevent strokes, has gone away from that. So that's kind of an old term. CVA, or cerebral vascular accident, is kind of an old term, and we tend just to go with stroke. Okay, you guys okay with that? That's known as an ischemic or a thrombotic or embolic stroke, where you have a clot that causes ischemia. The other type of stroke tends to be less common than this type, but the other type is when a vessel ruptures and causes bleeding into the brain, and that's known as a hemorrhagic stroke. And that can be the result of different problems. Hemorrhagic strokes often are the result of either trauma, you get hit, or you have what's known as an aneurysm. An area of the vessel kind of pouches out, it becomes weakened, and then it ruptures and bleeds out in the brain. Okay? And we talked about aneurysms when we talked about the circle of Willis, because sometimes you get aneurysms right there in the circle of Willis at the base of the brain. And if they rupture, they tend to be pretty bad. They tend to cause pretty devastating problems. Okay, are you guys okay with all of that information that I just covered?
Is the circle of Willis more vulnerable than other brain vessels?
For aneurysms, yes. Yeah, and aneurysms tend to develop where you have branching, where you have lots of blood vessels branching. So in the brain, aneurysms are, I mean, you can have them anywhere, but they do tend to be common in the circle of Willis, just like aneurysms in your abdomen tend to be more common around your kidneys, or where the vessels, the mesenteric vessels, arteries come off that go into your intestines when you have branching. And that's just, where you have, a vessel branching off of another one, that's just an opportunity for a weakness to develop. So that's why. Any other questions over all this stuff? Again, I wish I had some better answers about this whole consciousness thing. We just don't yet. We're working on it really hard, but who knows how far, what we'll get to. Okay, take a 10-minute break, guys, and then we'll come back. We will talk about endocrinology in some detail, and then we'll do a review.